The moment you step into Henry VIII's bedchamber, you should know this is no place of rest, no sanctuary of intimacy. It is a realm of fear, control, and twisted desire, where one man's cruelty shapes the lives of everyone around him. In this room, power and obsession intertwine, turning every glance, every gesture, and even the slightest thought into potential grounds for punishment. No light can pierce the darkness of his command, and no wall can shield you from his relentless scrutiny. Henry VIII was not merely a powerful king, he was a master of manipulation, a man who dictated every detail of daily life down to the most trivial acts. Every movement, every breath taken in his presence could be measured, judged, and used against you. To live under his roof was to live in a constant state of tension, a psychological battlefield where a misstep could trigger humiliation, isolation, or worse. He wielded fear as effortlessly as a scepter, and his whims were law. What Henry wanted went far beyond personal preference or ordinary demands. He turned his private chamber, supposedly a space of privacy for others, into a prison of control, where every servant, lady-in-waiting, and future queen became a pawn in his relentless game. Bathing, attire, the arrangement of the bed, even the hours of day and night were dictated to an obscene degree. One mistake could cost respect, status, or even safety. Inside Henry VIII's bedchamber, desire and authority merged into a nightmare of the mind. No one could refuse, no one could hide a secret, and no one could escape the crushing psychological pressure. Every detail served a single purpose: to satisfy Henry's absolute and terrifying control, and to break the spirit of anyone who dared enter his world. And this is just the beginning. In this series, we will reveal the 8 horrifying rules Henry forced upon his queens and consorts, each one designed to dominate, terrify, and crush them completely. If you want to uncover more dark secrets of history's most ruthless rulers, make sure to subscribe to the channel now and turn on notifications. You will not want to miss what comes next. Rule 1: no privacy. For Catherine of Aragon, entering Henry VIII's bedchamber was like stepping into a prison without bars. The first rule she quickly learned was that privacy did not exist. Every moment of her day, from the moment she woke until she went to sleep, was observed and dictated. There were no corners to retreat to, no quiet moments to collect her thoughts. Every gesture was scrutinized, every word remembered. The sense of being constantly watched gnawed at her mind, leaving no room for relief or comfort. Even something as simple as getting dressed became an ordeal. Servants were present to ensure that every garment met the king's standards. Catherine could not choose her attire freely, and she could not even spend a single hour alone. The bedchamber, meant to be private, became a stage where every action was a performance, judged and recorded in Henry's memory. There were no personal diaries, no whispered confidences, no place to be herself. The king demanded total visibility, and Catherine learned that even the smallest sign of hesitation or distraction could bring disapproval or worse consequences. Meals and personal routines were similarly controlled. Catherine had to appear at precisely the time specified by the king. She could not linger, she could not delay, and she certainly could not speak or move in a way that displeased him. Even fleeting glances were dangerous if interpreted incorrectly. The psychological strain of this constant surveillance created a sense of paranoia, a feeling that even her thoughts might betray her. She began to measure every smile, every sigh, every movement as if walking on a tightrope over a pit of uncertainty. The lack of privacy extended to her most intimate moments. Catherine could not retreat even to meditate or pray in solitude. Every hour of the day was subject to intrusion, and the presence of others in the room, whether servants or officials, reinforced the idea that she was never alone. The walls themselves seemed to conspire against her, echoing every sound and intensifying the sense of exposure. There was no escape, and no way to protect herself from the relentless gaze of power. Living under this rule slowly chipped away at Catherine's confidence and sense of identity. She learned to suppress her emotions, to hide fear and exhaustion behind a composed facade. Every day was a calculated act of endurance, and every night she went to bed knowing she would wake to the same surveillance and scrutiny. The king's control was total, and Catherine understood that any lapse, any perceived weakness, could shift favor, bring humiliation, or endanger her position entirely. No privacy meant no safety, no comfort, and no relief. For Catherine of Aragon, it was a rule that defined her existence in Henry VIII's court. It was the first step in a long series of constraints that transformed her life into a constant battle for survival under the weight of absolute authority. Rule 2. Forced intimacy. Anne Boleyn, unlike any queen before her, stepped into Henry VIII's bedchamber under a constant cloud of fear. The second horrifying rule she had to obey was forced intimacy. There was no room to refuse, no moment to claim autonomy. Every time the king demanded her presence, it became a battle of will and survival, where hesitation or resistance could invite anger, suspicion, or worse. The bedchamber was not a sanctuary, but a stage where obedience was measured, and Anne's every movement was scrutinized. The pressure on Anne was magnified by Henry's obsession with producing a male heir. Each encounter was not just about desire, but about fulfilling the king's demand for a son. The expectation that she must conceive a boy added unbearable stress. Anne's mind raced with fear and anticipation, knowing that any failure could shift the king's favor, tarnish her reputation, and even endanger her life. The intimacy that might have once been personal was twisted into a mechanism of domination, reminding her daily that her body and her future were controlled entirely by Henry. Every approach by the king was a test. Anne trembled as she walked into the room, her eyes wide with a mix of dread and caution. She forced herself to suppress fear, to mask hesitation behind a composed exterior. The psychological toll was immense. She had to perform compliance perfectly, concealing every flicker of emotion that might signal resistance. Even a fleeting expression of reluctance could be noted and remembered, becoming ammunition in the relentless game of power Henry played. This rule ensured that Anne's emotional and physical boundaries were obliterated. She could never retreat, never find a private moment to gather her thoughts, and never assert control over her own life. Every intimate encounter reinforced the hierarchy in Henry's court, making it painfully clear that her survival and status depended entirely on submission and endurance. Forced intimacy became a daily struggle between the human desire for autonomy and the absolute authority of the king. For Anne Boleyn, each step into Henry's chamber was a confrontation with fear, a reminder that her body was a tool of expectation and a test of resilience that weighed on her every waking hour. The bedchamber was a crucible, forging obedience from terror, and every encounter left her spirit more aware of the relentless power that dominated her life. Rule 3. Complete secrecy. For Jane Seymour, life at Henry VIII's court was a constant exercise in silence. The third horrifying rule she had to obey was complete secrecy. Every detail of her personal life, every interaction with the king, and every fleeting thought had to be guarded carefully. Speaking too freely, revealing too much, or even exchanging a seemingly innocent glance could have devastating consequences. The bedchamber was no longer a private space. It had become a place where words and gestures were monitored, catalogued, and potentially weaponized against her. Jane quickly learned that the stakes were extraordinarily high. Her reputation and dignity rested entirely on her ability to remain discreet. One careless comment could erode her standing, and any breach of secrecy could tarnish her honor permanently. In a court driven by suspicion and intrigue, even minor slips were magnified, becoming fodder for gossip and a source of leverage for those who sought to manipulate the king or undermine her position. The knowledge that a single misstep could destroy her future cast a constant shadow over her every action. The pressure to remain silent extended beyond words. Every expression, every movement, and every reaction could be interpreted. Jane often found herself sitting alone in the dim light of her chambers, hands trembling, aware that even an innocent look could be twisted into evidence of disloyalty or hidden intentions. In those moments, the weight of secrecy pressed down on her chest, making breathing feel heavy and making her hyper-aware of every interaction. The bedchamber became a theater of constant self-control, where vigilance was necessary to survive. Even her relationship with the king was subject to these rules. Nothing could be spoken or shared beyond what the king allowed, and even then, it was surrounded by layers of caution. Jane had to guard the most intimate moments, knowing that any detail could be misconstrued or used against her. Her private thoughts became a battlefield, and the ability to conceal fear, desire, or doubt was a critical skill. The psychological strain of this forced secrecy left her perpetually tense, never fully at ease, and painfully conscious of the fragility of her position. This rule served a clear purpose for Henry VIII. Complete secrecy reinforced his absolute control over the queens and consorts. It ensured that no one could act independently, and that every aspect of their lives was a reflection of his will. For Jane Seymour, secrecy was both a shield and a cage. It protected her from direct accusation in some cases, but it also isolated her, leaving her constantly on edge, aware that any mistake could undo years of careful survival. In Henry VIII's court, words, gestures, and even the smallest thoughts could become weapons. For Jane Seymour, the rule of absolute secrecy was a daily test of endurance and intelligence, forcing her to navigate a world where silence was not just expected, it was required to live, thrive, and maintain her honor. Rule 4. Body and fertility inspection. Anne of Cleves entered Henry VIII's world filled with hope and expectation, only to face one of the most invasive rules of the court, the scrutiny of her body and reproductive potential. The moment she arrived, it became clear that her worth in Henry's eyes was measured not by character or intelligence, but by physical appearance and the ability to provide an heir. Every glance, every curve, every movement was under assessment, and there was no room for error. The inspections were methodical and humiliating. Anne was required to stand still while courtiers and physicians measured and examined her. Notes were taken, charts filled, and her body became an object of judgment. The process was clinical yet deeply personal, stripping her of dignity and reducing her existence to a series of evaluations. Even minor imperfections or perceived shortcomings could have catastrophic consequences. The atmosphere was heavy with tension. and Anne's heart raced as she realized that her future depended entirely on passing these relentless tests. Henry himself observed the inspections with an intensity that magnified Anne's anxiety. She understood that his approval was absolute, and his rejection could be swift and merciless. Every movement had to convey grace and compliance. Yet the pressure to meet his subjective standards made even the simplest gestures fraught with risk. Anne's mind became a battlefield, balancing the need to appear composed while concealing fear and humiliation. There was no private moment to recover, no respite from the scrutiny that seemed to permeate every corner of the court. The psychological toll was profound. Anne internalized the knowledge that her future as queen, her reputation, and even her sense of self were contingent on a judgment she could not influence. The inspection was not just physical. It was an assault on her autonomy and her dignity. Each note, each observation felt like a verdict, and the anticipation of Henry's final decision loomed over her constantly. The stress was so intense that even small mistakes in posture, expression, or composure were magnified into perceived failures. Ultimately, the inspections led to a devastating outcome. Henry decided to annul the marriage after only a few months, claiming that Anne did not meet the standards he had set. The rejection, though cloaked in political reasoning, left Anne with a lingering trauma, an acute sense of inadequacy imposed by an impossible and invasive scrutiny. The rule of body and fertility inspection demonstrated the terrifying extent of control Henry exercised, showing that even a queen could be assessed and discarded like an object. For Anne of Cleves, the inspections were more than humiliating procedures. They were a psychological ordeal, a constant reminder of vulnerability and dependence on the king's approval. Each day spent under observation reinforced the chilling reality of absolute power, leaving her to navigate fear, uncertainty, and the harsh judgment of a ruler who treated human worth as measurable and conditional. Rule 5. Bizarre bedroom rituals. For Catherine Howard, Henry VIII's bedchamber was more than a place of intimacy. It was a place of ritualized terror. The fifth horrifying rule she had to obey involved strict and bizarre bedroom rituals, where every aspect of her appearance, behavior, and even hygiene was dictated by the king or his attendants. These rituals were obsessive and meticulous, leaving no room for error, hesitation, or personal preference. Catherine quickly learned that failing to comply could lead to severe consequences, including public humiliation and, in extreme cases, death. Every day began with procedures that tested her patience and nerve. Catherine was required to bathe under the supervision of attendants, ensuring that every detail met the king's exacting standards. She could not choose her own garments. Her clothing, hair, and even accessories were dictated by rules that emphasized the king's perception of propriety and beauty. The rituals extended to the arrangement of her bed, the order of nightly preparations, and even the timing of each step. Every act was performed under observation, leaving Catherine feeling like a performer in a play where a single misstep could provoke anger or ridicule. The psychological impact of these rituals was profound. Catherine learned to anticipate scrutiny at every moment, adjusting her posture, movements, and expressions to avoid drawing negative attention. The pressure to perform flawlessly created constant anxiety, a fear that never left her even in the supposed privacy of her chamber. She became hyper-aware of her surroundings, noting the flicker of torchlight, the shift of attendants, and the gaze of those charged with monitoring her compliance. The bedchamber, bathed in dim yellow light, felt like a gilded prison where obedience was measured with terrifying precision. Failure to follow these rituals was not tolerated. Catherine experienced scolding and humiliation for even minor lapses, which reinforced the absolute power the king wielded over her. These punishments were both psychological and social, designed to remind her and others that her life and honor were contingent on compliance. The rituals were more than arbitrary rules. They were tools of control, shaping behavior, reinforcing dependence, and instilling fear. Catherine Howard's days were defined by repetition, vigilance, and the constant awareness that every action mattered. The bedroom rituals turned what should have been private moments into exercises in surveillance and discipline. Even small deviations could become a scandal, damaging her reputation or threatening her position at court. Her body, gestures, and even glances were constantly under judgment, leaving her with no space to act naturally or freely. These bizarre rituals revealed the depths of Henry VIII's obsession with control. For Catherine Howard, life became a careful negotiation with fear and expectation, where the simplest acts of daily living were transformed into tests of obedience, endurance, and survival. The bedchamber was a crucible of power and terror, shaping the queen into a reflection of the king's demands and nothing more. Rule 6. Punctual appearance. For Catherine Parr, one of the most oppressive rules of Henry VIII's court was the demand for perfect punctuality. The sixth terrifying command dictated that she appear whenever the king wished, without delay, excuse, or hesitation. There was no consideration for fatigue, illness, or personal circumstance. Every step she took toward the bedchamber was measured against an invisible clock, and any deviation from the expected arrival could provoke disapproval, anger, or humiliation. The weight of this rule was visible in every aspect of her behavior. Catherine's footsteps often trembled as she approached the king's presence, her heart hammering at the thought of being even a moment late. The shadows in the hallway stretched unnaturally, and the long figure of Henry could seem to loom over her, turning a simple walk into a journey of dread. Even her breathing became controlled and careful, as though any sign of haste, hesitation, or panic could be noted and judged. The bedchamber was not simply a room. It was a stage where every arrival was scrutinized and every delay punished in subtle or severe ways. Catherine learned quickly that timing was more than convenience. It was a measure of obedience and loyalty. A queen who appeared late risked more than a fleeting frown. She risked damage to her reputation, loss of favor, and a reminder that her life and dignity were governed entirely by the king's whims. Each punctual appearance became a ritual of submission, where control was reinforced and personal autonomy stripped away. Even a slight misstep in timing could ripple through the court, becoming gossip or leverage for rivals. The psychological pressure was constant. Catherine could never relax, never linger, and never act on her own schedule. Every moment of anticipation before an appearance was filled with anxiety, as she calculated her movements and prepared herself mentally and physically for the king's judgment. The awareness that Henry's eyes, or the eyes of his attendants, might catch the slightest imperfection created a persistent state of vigilance, where even small actions were laden with consequence. This rule demonstrated the absolute control Henry exerted over his queens. For Catherine Parr, punctuality was not simply a matter of courtesy, it was a demonstration of subservience, a daily test of composure and courage. Each arrival under scrutiny reinforced the hierarchy of power, leaving no room for delay, excuse, or personal freedom. The shadows of the hallways, the echo of her footsteps, and the weight of the king's presence combined to create an environment where fear and anticipation were inseparable companions. In Henry VIII's court, appearing on time was more than etiquette. It was a tool of domination, a subtle reminder that the Queen's life, honor, and favor rested entirely in the hands of a ruler whose demands were absolute. For Catherine Parr, every step toward the bedchamber was a test, a challenge, and a confrontation with the relentless authority of the king. Rule 7: No private communication. For Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, the seventh horrifying rule was total isolation. Both queens were forbidden from private conversation with anyone, even trusted attendants. Friendship, counsel, or simple companionship were replaced by an invisible cage, where every word and gesture could be observed and potentially used against them. The rule created a suffocating environment, stripping them not only of social contact, but of emotional support, leaving the queens vulnerable to fear, anxiety, and despair. The isolation was total. Courtiers were present during every interaction, and even seemingly private moments were subject to observation. Anne and Catherine quickly learned that any attempt to speak privately could provoke suspicion or accusation, with consequences ranging from reprimand to loss of favor or even arrest. Letters, notes, and gestures were closely monitored. The queens existed in a constant state of vigilance, knowing that secrecy itself could be dangerous. Even innocent communication could be twisted into evidence of disloyalty or impropriety. Psychologically, this rule was devastating. Anne, who had endured the intense pressure of forced intimacy and the constant demand to produce a male heir, found herself cut off from allies or confidants, unable to share her fears or thoughts. Catherine, already living under the oppressive rituals of the bedchamber, faced similar torment. The isolation created a sense of living in a glass cage, where every emotion was amplified and every movement observed. Anxiety became a constant companion, and moments of quiet reflection were replaced by an unrelenting awareness of surveillance. The toll on mental health was severe. Both queens experienced stress, depression, and a sense of disconnection from the world outside the palace. They had no opportunity to seek comfort, advice, or reassurance, leaving them to face the relentless demands of the king and court entirely alone. Every day became a test of endurance, where survival depended on self-control, caution, and the ability to mask fear and despair. Isolation also reinforced the king's power. By controlling who the queens could speak to, Henry ensured that loyalty and obedience were absolute. Friends could not intervene, rivals could not warn, and the queen's autonomy was reduced to the narrowest confines. In this environment, fear and dependency became tools of control, as the queens were forced to navigate court life without any support or companionship. For Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, being forbidden to communicate privately was more than a rule. It was a form of psychological torture. It magnified their vulnerability, eroded confidence, and created a world where every thought and action was scrutinized. The queens were left to endure isolation, fear, and relentless observation, a chilling reminder of the absolute and suffocating power Henry VIII wielded over their lives. Rule 8: The terrifying pressure to bear a son. For every queen who married Henry VIII, the ultimate horror was the pressure to bear a male heir. This was not a matter of personal desire or family planning. It was a matter of survival and status. The king's approval, the queen's security, and even their honor rested entirely on their ability to conceive a son. Failure to deliver a male child could result in loss of favor, replacement, or lasting scorn. The weight of this expectation was overwhelming, transforming pregnancy into a battlefield of fear and anxiety. Each pregnancy became a relentless trial. Every day, every sensation, and every movement was filtered through the lens of potential success or failure. The queens were acutely aware that a single miscarriage, a weak or female child, or even perceived shortcomings in their body could be catastrophic. The psychological toll was immense, with anxiety and dread overshadowing moments that should have been filled with hope. Each heartbeat of the unborn child was matched by the pulse of fear in the mother, a constant reminder that her fate was tied to something she could never fully control. The pressure extended beyond the physical. The queens were constantly observed, and their condition was scrutinized by physicians and attendants who measured every symptom and reported on every detail. The court's whispers carried weight, as gossip could amplify failure or diminish the queen's standing. The sense of being constantly evaluated left the queens on edge, unable to relax or feel safe. Even private moments of reflection were tainted by the knowledge that judgment was never far away. Visually, the scene was harrowing. The queen clutched her swollen belly, a fragile shield against the crushing authority of the king. Her eyes reflected terror and exhaustion, a mix of hope for the child and fear of the consequences. The bedchamber, usually a space of intimacy, became a theater of anxiety, where the queen's body and mind were under continuous surveillance, and every movement of the unborn child was interpreted as either success or failure. This pressure to produce a male heir reinforced the absolute dominance of Henry VIII. It reduced the queen's existence to a single, almost mechanical function, stripping away autonomy, emotional safety, and the ability to live free from fear. Each day of pregnancy was a mental and emotional struggle, where the queens navigated terror, hope, and the oppressive knowledge that their value was defined by the gender of their child. Ultimately, the rule to bear a son represented the pinnacle of the king's control and cruelty. It was a reminder that for a queen in Henry's court, survival was never guaranteed, and every moment of her life could be dominated by anxiety, expectation, and the unrelenting demand to produce a male heir. In this relentless system, fear became as constant as breathing, and the pressure to fulfill this singular duty was a torment that defined the lives of every woman who dared to marry Henry VIII. The 8 horrifying bedroom rules of Henry VIII reveal a chilling truth about life under his reign. These were not mere personal preferences or eccentricities of a king. They were instruments of absolute control, designed to dominate, intimidate, and subjugate the queens at every turn. From forced intimacy to total surveillance, from public humiliation to the relentless pressure to produce a male heir, each rule reinforced a system where fear was constant and freedom was non-existent. The queens' lives were meticulously controlled, their bodies scrutinized, their words monitored, and their emotions manipulated. Every day was a test of obedience, endurance, and psychological resilience. For Anne Boleyn, Catherine Howard, Jane Seymour, Anne of Cleves, and Catherine Parr. These rules created a world of unending tension and dread. Privacy was impossible, companionship forbidden, and even the most intimate moments were subject to scrutiny. The psychological impact was profound, leaving them to navigate a labyrinth of fear, humiliation, and anxiety. Their survival depended not on loyalty, love, or virtue, but on meeting the arbitrary and often cruel expectations of a monarch whose desire for control was total. Henry VIII was more than a ruler. He was the embodiment of terrifying power in every detail of daily life. His authority infiltrated every corner of the Queen's existence, transforming the bedchamber into a theater of fear, obsession, and domination. Each rule, each ritual, and each expectation was a reflection of his unyielding will and the absolute hierarchy he imposed. The Queen's suffering stands as a testament to the devastating human cost of unchecked power and obsession. These rules remind us that in Henry VIII's court, power was measured not only by armies or wealth, but by the ability to control the very thoughts, movements, and bodies of those closest to him. The horror of his reign was intimate, constant, and inescapable, leaving a legacy of fear and tragedy that resonates centuries later. If you want to uncover more chilling secrets of kings, monarchs, and the dark corners of history, hit the subscribe button and turn on the notification bell now. Explore with us the hidden horrors behind royal splendor, and witness how absolute power can twist human lives into a tapestry of fear, control, and obsession.